Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last session of the day in this room about lifelong learning and interpreting as a profession in which you continue to learn throughout your life. I have with me three panelists, Beth from the Commission, Lydia from the Court of Justice, and Lorraine from the Parliament. I will introduce them again properly in a couple of minutes because I just want to allow everybody to join the session. I can see that we already have a huge number of people. We're thrilled to see you all here. We'd love to know where you're from. I see we've got a message already from Olivier, who's here joining us from Belgium, but what about the rest of you? Iceland, wow, let us know where you're from in the chat. Gosh, all sorts of interesting places. It's lovely for us to see that so many people are interested in this topic, which is obviously something that's very close to our heart. But we see people joining from the UK, from Russia, from the Czech Republic, from Italy. Please keep letting us know where you're from so that we know who we're talking to. And in a few minutes, we're going to do some polling as well and see that you can, so where you can tell us a little bit more about yourself in a minute in the polls, but for now it's just really great to see where everybody is joining us from. So I'm sure you're all Zoom experts, much more than I am, but just to let you know that during, as I said, during this session, we will be launching some polls, but they'll pop up on your screen as and when. We're going to ask you the questions. And we also have a question and answer tab. I hope you can see that. So do please feel free to put any questions that you have that you would like me to put to the panelists in the Q&A section. The chat is more really for chatting. So do please keep telling us where you're from and perhaps, you know, maybe why don't you let us know in the chat as well why you're interested in this session in particular, just whilst we're waiting for more people to join. So do chat away to us. We're keeping a close eye on that. But any specific questions that you would like to put to the panelists, particularly whilst they're speaking, if something occurs to you, then please put it in the Q&A part, and I will keep an eye on that. And when each panelist is finished, I will see if there are any burning questions for them. Otherwise, there'll be quite short presentations from the three panelists, because we do want to make sure that there's plenty of space for you to ask any questions you like about interpreting. This is a great opportunity for you because you have three interpreters here who are panelists. I'm an interpreter myself as well. But I'm in the background just organizing you. So I will, if you have any questions for our panelists about interpreting, there's no such thing as a daft question. So please ask anything you want. I'm pleased to see that we've got people who are language students who are joining, other people joining us from Rio, but perhaps we'll get straight on and ask our first question actually in the polls, which will allow you to tell us a little bit more about yourself. So I'm going to just click on the poll now and launch that poll. So it would be really interesting for us to know what you're doing. Are you a language student? Are you an interpreting student? Hang on, for some reason the polling's closed. Let me relaunch that. Right, okay, now you can go. I hope you can see the poll on your screen. There's people working in the chat as well, brilliant. So there's lots of different options there. Interesting. And lots of people, we've got blue on every single answer. That's great. So we have language students, we have interpreting students, we've got working interpreters, we've got interpreter trainer, languages teachers, language lovers, and none of the above. None of the above. Why don't you write in the chat what you are then if you're none of the above, because I'm curious now. So great. I can see that nearly 80% of the participants have answered the questions. Please do answer the questions, because it's really interesting for us to know who we're talking to. Because of the nature of this online seminar, we can't see you, unfortunately, which is a terrible shame for us. And we can't hear you either, but this is how you get your voice heard, by answering the questions in the polls, by writing in the chat, and of course asking us questions. And I see that it's Sophia, who's none of the above, but an accountant. Brilliant. But I suspect that's a profession where you also have to learn all throughout your life. So that it's not the only profession, but that's what we're going to be talking about most today, of course, lifelong learning. So really fascinating to see that. It's sort of, it's neck and neck, languages students and interpreting students. And I hope that by the time we finish this seminar, and by the time the London Languages show is finished, some of those language students might think that interpreting is a job for them. That's what we're hoping. So let me end that poll now. And I see that there is a question already there, but we will come back to that, Martina, don't worry, later in the session. Oh, Language Lover has just crept into the lead there. Of course, we're all language lovers, aren't we? And it's a multiple choice, so that's great. I hope that you can see the results there yourselves. So let us carry on. I have just a couple more questions for you before our panelists start, because it'd be interesting for us to know, you know, what you know already about interpreting, and about interpreting in the EU institutions in particular, because it is quite a special place. I'm trying to get back to my second question. Let me try. Sorry, I apologize. That's the same one. Here we go. Here's the second one. So I wonder how many of you know how many official languages there are in the EU. So that might be an easy question for those who are interpreting students. We'll see. And our panelists will be telling you more about this, of course, during the session. And will explain, it might explain why we have to keep learning throughout our lives. So 70% of people have voted, and 24 is the favorite option at the moment. Okay, right, well, I'm going to end the poll there, because over 80% of people have voted, and in fact 70% of you are quite right. There are 24 official languages in the EU. So well done everybody. And then one last one before we get on to the hearing from the panelists. And don't worry, I'm noting down everybody's questions, and we will get to them at the end of the session. So the next one is, by the end of their careers, an EU interpreter on average has how many passive languages? So from how many languages do EU interpreters interpret by the end of their careers? And that's an important first little half of the sentence, because nobody starts with, well, very few people start with 3, and I'm not sure anybody starts with 6. Have a best guess. It's a guesstimate. Some of you may know, but for others of you, it will just be a guess. And of course, you know, it is on average. So some people have more, some people have less. You can see it's close between 4 and 5. So let me end the poll there and share the results. And in fact, 5 has inched into the lead, and that is actually the right question, the right answer rather to the question. I think it's something like, on the average is 4.8 because it's a statistical number, but yes, so 5 is between 4 and 5, let's say. So all of those people were quite right, and that again explains why we need to keep learning throughout our entire lives when we're interpreters. So we are going to move straight on to hear from our panelists. And I believe it's Beth who's going to get the ball rolling. So Beth, go ahead, please.
Hi, can you hear me? Give me a nod. Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this session. I know it's a late one, but thanks for joining. I'm Beth Black, as you can see from my name. I am an interpreter working at the EU, at the European Commission, and I work in the English language unit. We just talked a bit about how many languages people normally start with and how many they have. And I was one of the people who started with 2 languages, with French and German. And then I learnt Dutch while I was here, and I'm currently working on Italian. So I'm inching my way closer to having the average number of languages, but it's one of the things I'm looking forward to continuing throughout my career. I actually wanted to focus the next couple of minutes on a different aspect, though. I wanted to talk more about interpreting skills and how you develop them throughout your career, because a lot of us have quite a similar career path, although people join interpreting from all walks of life. With lots of different backgrounds. I was one of the people who studied languages at undergraduate and then did a master's course to train, although there are other ways into the profession. And say you do your master's course and you do your basic training there and you get your qualification, then one way to start working in a conference interpreting is to sit a test. And at the EU institutions, there's an accreditation test to become a freelancer. And that's what I did. But once you pass that test, if you do, that doesn't just mean that you can suddenly do interpreting and you stop learning. In fact, I found out that it was the start of quite a steep learning curve once I really got into the world of work. And I think that's partly because interpreting is an art, not a science. It's something that is very dynamic. It's one of the most exciting things I think you can do with your languages that you've learned. And that's what drew me to the profession. And even though it's a very varied job, a typical day for me, in any case, involves going into a booth and doing simultaneous interpreting. So there are lots of other ways that you might end up doing interpreting at the European Commission and other EU institutions. A lot of the work does involve simultaneous interpreting. And I think it's fair to say there are skills that you start learning even as a language learner that stand you in good stead for this job, and that you keep honing and refining all the way through your career. But specifically when you're doing simultaneous interpreting, there's so much going on, there's so many cogs turning, you're trying to keep loads of plates spinning at the same time. And I think that one of the skills that I got a little better at with more experience was anticipation, figuring out what's likely to come next, being able to take a gamble on something, particularly if it's German and you need to guess a verb, which otherwise you might be waiting for quite a long time if it comes at the end of a sentence. So that's one of the really specific interpreting skills that I think you get better at over time. And one thing that a lot of people say about interpreting, particularly simultaneous, is that it must be very stressful. And I think that it can actually give you a bit of a kick when it goes well. And I think that you learn to kind of harness the energy that you can get from a little bit of stress. more and more to give you the boost that you need to keep up with, say, slightly more challenging speakers or more difficult speakers. So I'd say that you definitely get better at stress management, which also then helps, because I remember the first time I turned on the microphone in the booth, I sounded very nervous indeed. And I think that that fades as you get more confident in your skills. And then there are all sorts of very specific skills that you get better at using when you're facing really difficult speakers. So you figure out how to prioritize what they're saying, how to condense things, and that can be really, really useful, particularly if you're running behind someone who might be reading something out or might be speaking particularly quickly. And I remember when I started, that that sort of experience would really have thrown me, and I would have just wanted to give up. But you do learn on the job in this job, and you also learn from your colleagues. So once you pass this sort of test, once you get in the booth, you are sort of thrown in at the deep end, but there's a lot of support from colleagues. And at the Commission, there's also a scheme to help new interpreters so that they get some mentoring and get good advice and some help with training. But that's my reminder to tell me to stop talking. But when I said it's a steep learning curve, that doesn't mean that it just stops. It doesn't ever stop, because it's a job that's really full of variety and challenges. And I think you go into the booth every day hoping that you'll do a good job, that maybe today will be the perfect day. And I'm still waiting for that day. But I have to say that in the process of aiming for sort of perfect interpretation, you learn a great deal, and I hope that that never stops anyway.
Thank you very much, Beth. Yes, the perfect day of interpreting. I wonder, it's a bit the holy grail, isn't it? I'm not sure that it actually exists. And I had the exact same thing when I started interpreting. I remember a very experienced colleague. I was in the plenary actually in Parliament, and she was sitting next to me, and she said, "Can I give you some advice?" And yes, please. She said, "Just bring down your voice. It's about an octave too high." And that's because that's what happens when you get stressed, that your voice just gets really high. And it's very unpleasant to listen to. Whereas Beth has this lovely deep voice when she speaks naturally. And yeah, that's what you need to channel when you're in the booth desperately waiting for that German verb. That's a question that people always ask you, isn't it? Well, how on earth do you interpret German? I think all of us here interpret from German, and yeah, there's a lot of anticipation goes on indeed. So thank you very much, Beth. It's really interesting to hear about all of these different skills, which of course you have to some extent when you start, because you have to have them to pass the test. But it's rather like, I always think it's rather like passing your driving test. Yeah, you've got the piece of paper, but you just need quite a lot of hours on the road, and you need quite a lot of hours and days and months in the booth, don't you, at the beginning, before you feel like you're a confident interpreter or a confident driver. So yeah, those skills just grow and grow, and you go from a novice interpreter to a sort of expert interpreter by the end of your career. But indeed, it never stops, and that's why we love it so much. So I'm going to hand over to Lorraine next, who's going to talk a little bit more about languages and how we keep learning those languages. So go ahead, Lorraine.
Good afternoon to you all. It's lovely to see such a large turnout this late in the day, and on a Saturday, no less. My name is Lorraine Regan. I'm a staff interpreter at the European Parliament, as you can see from my tagline. I am an English native speaker, and my language combination is French, German, Spanish, and Dutch. I started my interpreting career with just 2 languages. Like Beth, I had French and German. I began learning Spanish while I was still a freelancer, but I completed my training and took a test to add the language after I joined the European Parliament. And I have since learnt Dutch from scratch whilst on staff. Now, Beth has provided you with an excellent overview of how we hone our skills throughout our interpreting careers. In my short opening statement, I'd just like to say a few words about how we learn a new language to the standard required for interpretation while still holding down a full-time job. And I'd like to structure my comments around 3 headline messages, if I may. The first is that the buck stops with you. You know yourself, you know your learning capabilities, how you can best juggle learning a new language with your personal or work commitments. So you need to take charge of your learning pathway. And it's not easy. It is invigorating, but it takes hard work and it takes discipline. When I began learning Spanish as a freelancer, I initially spent a fair amount of time swatting away by myself. I then signed up for language classes at the Cervantes Institute. I arranged private tuition together with a few interpreter friends to keep the costs down. I organised intensive language stays in different regions throughout Spain because I wanted to ensure exposure to the myriad accents in which the language is spoken. Now, that approach was a little bit scattergun. It meant that I was changing teachers and schools a lot. So I found it very useful early on for Spanish, but also later on for Dutch, to sit down with a good grammar book, to work my way through the theory, the practice exercises, make sure that I'd really consolidated the basics. And then as my understanding of my new language improved, I started following the news in that language, reading as much as I could, and podcasts are a wonderful resource that, yes, I can see nodding heads, that we all use extensively. Now, my second message is that although you do need to take the initiative when it comes to your new language, support is available. And it comes in many forms: the kindness of fellow interpreters and the official support provided by the court, the commission, and the parliament. When I was learning Spanish as a freelancer, I was fortunate enough to be able to go on an exchange at an interpreting course in Spain that was organised through a fellow freelance interpreter. I offered practice speeches to the students in English, and in return, I got to practice interpreting from Spanish and sit in on lectures at the university, which was brilliant. When I started learning Dutch on staff, I joined a regular weekly class taught over a 5-year period with a mix of Dutch and Flemish teachers. I was given invaluable advice by our in-house training unit and steered towards opportunities to practice the language, intensive language courses. For example, I went on an exchange at the interpreting course at the University of Ghent. And of course, when I was gearing up to add those languages to take my test to interpret from first Spanish and then Dutch, I found my fellow interpreters in those booths to be endlessly kind and patient with their knowledge, their time, and their practice speeches. And to conclude, my final message, and it's perhaps the most important, is that you need to enjoy your new language. And that is because classroom time, study time, it's not going to cut it. You need more. You need to make your new language part of your leisure time, your hobbies, your holidays, your reading material, your music collection, whatever. I just give you some examples. I started yoga in Dutch. I fell in love with Spanish cinema. That's what worked for me. You need to obviously find what works for you, because trust me, that will make the whole language learning experience far more rewarding and far more enjoyable. So I think I'll leave it at that. I've probably gone on for long enough, and I'll hand back to Kathy.
No, it's lovely to listen to you, Lorraine, because you can really feel the passion that you have for learning languages. And I think, well, we all answered, didn't we, on the poll that we were language lovers, and you do really have to be to want to be an interpreter, particularly in the EU institutions, because as we saw, there are 24 official languages, and obviously the more languages you can cover, the more languages the booth covers, and that's of great interest for the three services, for the interpreting services. So it's needed, but it's also it's actually what drives a lot of interpreters. You know, we really want to learn new languages. I mean, it's you know, we're encouraged to, of course, and our employers, because we're all staff, but even as a freelance interpreter, once you're accredited and on the joint list for the three institutions, you also get help with language learning, because it's of great interest. It's a vested interest, let's say, for the service. So help is there, but it's also a great joy for us to learn new languages, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of you listening in today as well. We saw that people have a lot of languages, and some have more than one active language as well. We haven't spoken about that, but because so far we've been speaking more about passive languages, but of course people have active languages as well, a B language, and that takes probably even more practice. But I think Lorraine's quite right. You have to sort of live and breathe a language whilst you're acquiring it, but that's what we love about it. So thank you, Lorraine. Marketa, I saw your question in the question and answer tab, and I hope that so perhaps I can let everybody know what Marketa's question was. She wanted to have some tips for mastering a language. And I think that Lorraine gave you lots of really brilliant tips there. Go and do yoga in Dutch. That was my favorite one. I'm going to follow that advice as well, I think. Great. Thanks so much, Lorraine. Let's hear now from Lydia, who's going to be talking about another aspect of what you need to have as an interpreter. We've heard you need certain skills, certainly you need languages, but you need other things too, and we're going to hear from Lydia about that now. So go ahead, Lydia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? I hope I'm coming through clearly. Like Beth and Lorraine, I'd like to thank you all for attending this webinar on a Saturday evening when you might be thinking about doing other things. So it's lovely to see so many of you taking an interest in what we love doing. I'd like to say that my very first learning experience associated with interpreting was when I learned what the word meant as a child, because ever since then, it's what I've wanted to do. And so interpreting has really been a lifelong learning experience for me. I'm coming up for retirement now, and only the other day I learnt that I comply with the statistics, because I do have 5 passive languages at the end of my career. I have French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Danish, and I work in the English booth at the European Court in Luxembourg, so I'm not in Brussels like the rest of my colleague panelists. Now, Beth and Lorraine have very eloquently spoken to you about interpreting skills and about language learning, which of course are essential if you want to be an interpreter. But there is also a third body of knowledge, which is absolutely crucial for us to be able to do our job properly. And that is general knowledge, learning and taking an interest in how the world works, what is going on around us. An interpreter needs to have wide open eyes, wide open ears, and an inquisitive mind. One challenge in our job as interpreters, which our job is of course to help people communicate, is that the people that we help are generally experts in the field that we're working in. We, generally speaking, are not. We are maybe language experts, or some of us may have done a degree in another subject. I was a linguist, as my colleagues were. I started out with French and Italian, and that's what I had studied at university. But there are some people who have studied law, for example, or science, or economics. And well, they won't be so much on the back foot if they work in a meeting which deals with those subjects. Generally speaking, though, we are language experts, so it's important for us to make the effort to put on the overlay of knowledge of the subject that we will be interpreting in. A good example of this, in fact, is my own work at the European Court of Justice. Obviously a law institution. Very few of my colleagues have any kind of law qualification, and I certainly do not. So when I started working at the court, after working a few years at the Commission and as a freelance interpreter, it was a very steep learning curve indeed. We have to cover all sorts of subjects of EU policies. There are laws and rules about everything, but onto that we have to add the legal overlay, the legal jargon, the formulaic expressions, the Latin expressions, all sorts of things like that. And it is quite stressful and quite complicated at the beginning. We're working for expert lawyers, we're working for the judges who work at the court, so they are all in at a pretty high level of their own chosen careers. Having said that, though, at the court, we're very lucky to be given some time to prepare the hearings that we're assigned to. We have an office, which I'm sitting in at the moment, and we have fewer hearings. We have less booth time than maybe Beth and Lorraine have, but we have a chance to prepare our hearings, look up the vocabulary, study the arguments and so on. And without that, I can assure you that we would not be able to do the job. It is crucial to look into the background of what we're doing. As to how we go about the preparation, well, I can tell you that it's a lot easier now than when I started interpreting in the mid-1980s, when there was no internet, we didn't have computers. We had to, well, we really did have to try and find books and do what we could. Whereas now, as you know, everything like that is at our fingertips or one click away. But it is important to actually get clicking. And sometimes it can be fascinating too, because you start preparing for one subject and you click on a link and it takes you just on a slight digression, but it's really interesting and could be useful maybe for a meeting in a few days' time. So you're constantly acquiring knowledge and reading around the subject even, which is also extremely important. Acquiring a wide general knowledge is particularly important, in fact, at the beginning of our careers, when we are very unlikely to be specialized in anything and haven't yet acquired the experience and the background knowledge that we will acquire constantly, day by day, as we work as interpreters. We're very rarely specialized at the start of a career, and well, we do a different subject every day, which is one of the nice things. It's one of the perks of the job, and which makes it fascinating. It's quite the antithesis of drudgery, is interpreting. And it's not just a question of swatting up the subject of the day either. You're in a forum where there are representatives of many countries meeting up, different cultures, all sorts of differences which are interesting in themselves, and they will come up in the meeting. It's not just going to be turgid law or veterinary science or whatever it is. It's very important to have the cultural references, the culture of the languages, the passive languages you have, and also to keep in touch with important international events that have happened, and not just COP26 and the like, but the World Cup in football, for example, because you'll get some kind of sporting reference made as a joke or as a passing remark by a delegate. And if you haven't a clue who's won the final of the last World Cup or European Cup or something, you might be completely at a loss. Whereas if you do, that will be a real kick you'll really, you'll really feel good about that if you can make something of a little joke that somebody's made. And it's important to remember that we are always somebody else's mouthpiece. So we have to learn also to think beyond our own world, our own views, our own interests. For example, we all, I'm sure, have our own political views, but the person that you're interpreting doesn't necessarily have anything like the same political views as you have. Lorraine will know all about that, I'm sure, working at the Parliament as she does. The cases that I have to deal with, I might look through the arguments and think, well, this is an open and shut case. It's obvious that this person is completely wrong and doesn't have a leg to stand on. And then the lawyer I have to interpret will be exactly the one who is defending the one I don't think has a leg to stand on. And I can't let my own feelings and views go through into what I'm interpreting. You are literally the mouthpiece of the person you're working for. And that is an absolutely essential thing. I've probably gone on for too long. How do we keep on learning and expanding our knowledge? Well, Lorraine mentioned podcasts, TV programs, newspapers. You can get all these things online. Books. I learned salsa and flamenco, so that helped with my Spanish to some extent. So yeah, it's just important to keep your eyes and ears open and your mind inquisitive. I think that's the best advice I can give all of you, and good luck.
Yes, that's quite right, Lydia. Inquisitive and open minds, I think, was really the message that you were giving us. And when I was listening to you, I was struck by what you said about we have to be the mouthpiece of the people we're interpreting. And I remember a few years ago, when I was just starting out, somebody telling me, that the word for interpreter in French is interprète, and that actually also means actor or actress. And I often think about that. I do think you have to become the person that you are interpreting. And sometimes it's either easier than others, right? Like you said, Lydia, depending on who you're interpreting. But I think that having enough empathy to become another person is also something quite special. I don't think there are many jobs where you can really say that. So we've heard about how much of an adrenaline rush it is, really. Every day is different. You're very rarely actually in your comfort zone. I mean, there isn't really a comfort zone actually when you're an interpreter, but that is also why we love it so much. Sometimes people say to us, well, isn't it really stressful? And we say, yeah, that's why we love it, because we're all I think, sort of minor adrenaline junkies, and that's why we like this job so much. So thanks very much. I hope that those of you listening to us are enjoying the panelists' stories and advice as much as I am. It's such a joy to be sitting with these three very experienced interpreters and hearing their stories. But I'd like now to just open up some of the questions that we've already received from people sending in, and there are quite a few about languages, so I don't know if you want to take those, Lorraine. There was one very practical one, and I apologize in advance, Jonathan. It's true that we tend to speak a little bit in jargon. It's every profession has it, and Jonathan wasn't sure of what the difference between an active and a passive language was. So we've been banding that term around quite a lot already this afternoon. So perhaps if you could explain that, Lorraine.
Of course. An active language is a language into which you interpret. So in my case, I interpret into English. It's also my mother tongue. We do have some very talented interpreters who can work into a second active language. I know people in the Polish booth that work into Polish, but also have an active retour working into English or to German or to French. So that's your active language, the one in which you convey information. Your passive language is one that you understand very well. You have an excellent in-depth knowledge, but you would only listen to information in that passive language in a meeting and then relay that information in your active language. So in my case, in a meeting, if I hear something said in German or French, a comment in Spanish, or perhaps a counter argument in Dutch, those comments, it would fall to me to then relay that information in English to anyone following the meeting in English, my active language. So I hope that's cleared up the jargon we've been banding around here.
Yes, that was very clear, I think. There was another question to you, Lorraine, but I think Beth could equally answer it because you've also learnt other languages. The question was, when you're mainly surrounded by Spanish in your free time, didn't you have the feeling that you're neglecting your other languages that you already have? And she says she sometimes feels a bit guilty when she's focusing on learning a new language. And I'm sure we've all had that feeling, but Beth, how do you deal with that?
I can really relate. I often feel a little bit guilty about neglecting some of my languages, but I think it's part of the language learning journey is that it helps if you become a little bit obsessed with the new language. It's part of falling in love with it and the culture that goes with it and the country or countries where it's spoken. And in a way, it's a little bit like being in a new relationship. It does kind of exclude others for a while, but then normally, once you've learned the language for us to the level that that you need to start working with it, you can get back a little bit of balance, take some distance from it, and also remember all of the other languages that you also love and that you might have neglected a tiny bit for a while. But I think it's normal and healthy, and a great way to just keep on top of your other languages is to find things you enjoy. Like everyone has been saying, I have a roster of podcasts that I regularly listen to in various different languages. And as long as it's something you find interesting and engaging, I think it's then not a chore to do that language maintenance like work. It can be fun, and it can be something as simple as watching a fun TV show, or if you've got a TV show that's in English, sticking the subtitles on in a different language, just to have them there, just to keep the link between the two languages going. And also, normally you will make friends along the way when you learn languages, and staying in touch with those friends is, I think, one of the best and most fun ways of keeping up your link to that language.
Thank you very much for that, Beth. Moving away a little bit from languages and onto stress, and particularly stress relief. Lisa would like a top tip from each of you about how you deal with stress. I think I already know that Lorraine does yoga and Lydia does salsa, but maybe they have other top tips as well, and we haven't heard from Beth. So how do you cope with all the stress, and how do you relieve it at the end of the day? Lydia, any other tips?
Well, yeah, salsa and flamenco and things like that are, of course, physical exercise, and that I find, and yoga as well, of course, helps a lot because it's a contrast with the intense mental exercise you've been subjecting your brain to during your meeting, hearing, whatever it is. And so sometimes it's quite nice to be able to not quite shut your brain down, because you still have to coordinate the movements you're making, but at least not do stressful things with your brain, and think about getting out and moving your body and tiring yourself out a bit physically to offset the mental tiredness that you might have been through during the day. I think that would be my main tip.
Beth or Lorraine, anything to add to that one?
Apart from yoga, and to pick up on what Lydia said about physical exercise and fresh air. I've become a bit of a jogging junkie the last 10 to 15 years, and I find it's quite time efficient. I can head out for a quick half an hour run after a long day in the booth, and it sweeps away the cobwebs. One plus side of that as well is I have discovered the joys of wine marathons, and they tend to be organized in lovely regions in France and Germany. So you can combine business with pleasure there too.
What about you, Beth?
I fully agree with everything Lydia and Lorraine said. I also, I enjoy some exercise. Also became a big fan of yoga once I started work, because one of the biggest things that I took from regular yoga practice was remembering to breathe. It sounds so simple, but on my first day in the booth, what you said reminded me of this, Kathy. A very kind colleague waited until I turned off the microphone after sounding probably very nervous, and they said, "And breathe." And I realized I hadn't really been breathing. And I think that anything, meditation, yoga, jogging, that helps you remember that when you're stressed is very, very helpful. I personally am more of a swimmer. And I find that even though it's a little more time consuming, going for a swim before or after work really helps to wash the stress away if there is any. But for anyone looking for a way to deal with nerves and stress out there, if they've got exams, if they've got a test coming up or a stressful work assignment, you just have to find what works for you, whether it's something active, whether it's just chatting with friends, watching a film, doing some very vigorous baking. If you get a lot of stress release from kneading dough, that can work for some people. Yeah, it's very personal.
You see, well, women have many talents as interpreters. We can even bake bread. I have a question from Lauren, which I think is quite interesting. And it's also something that I get asked very frequently about interpreting it. And the question is, how do you deal with a difficult speaker? So either somebody who speaks very fast or who somebody has a very thick accent. I don't know who comes across that more often in their daily booth lives. Would any of you ladies like to answer? Lorraine?
I'll give it a go, and I'm sure that Beth and Lydia will want to add comments from their perspective. For me, it's something where I've seen that steep learning curve. It stressed me out no end when I started. I felt pulled along by the stress and the pace of those really fast speakers and the density. And it took me a couple of months, and I'm still sort of learning every day really how to manage my own stress, my own reaction, because ultimately I need to take a step back and start analyzing and prioritizing and weeding out a clear message. So that confidence to calm down, to say clearly the message that I'd gleaned, that was something I learned over time. Of course, to be able to do that, apart from practice, I find preparation invaluable. The more I get ahead of a meeting, particularly if I know that I'm likely to come across a tricky speaker or a really technical, difficult subject, well, the more material I'm given, the more documents I can read up, the research I can do, the better prepared I feel to deal, I feel that I am, and then I feel better ready to deal with that difficult speaker. Okay, I'll allow, I'm sure Lydia has some very tricky subjects coming up at the court, so I'd be keen to hear actually what she has to say here.
Well, at the court, we don't so much get difficult accents, because our clients are lawyers, so generally speaking, they will speak standard versions of the language that they're speaking. So I know that accents can sometimes be very, very tough indeed to cope with. And as Lorraine said, it's important, therefore, to try and encounter them before the meeting situation by going to countries or listening to a variety of programs. But what we do get is speed. And I have to say, and I apologize to any Spanish speakers in the audience, but the Spaniards are some of the worst. And what we often get is a text of the lawyer's pleadings sent to us in advance. So the advantage is that we have a chance to look through it and prepare any quotes of case law and what have you, legislation, things like that. But then because they know that they've got the text which they have sent to the interpreters, they will reel it off. They have a limited amount of time to speak, and the judges are very strict about that. They will reel it off at 200 miles an hour. And as Lorraine said, experience is the best lesson for that. And don't give up. If you encounter that, prioritize, get the main gist through, which is the most important. Finish your sentences. Don't stutter and stop in mid-sentence and then start the next paragraph, because you'll lose the confidence of your audience. Say less is more in a way. Finish your sentences, speak clearly, and breathe. That's what I would say.
Yes, lots of very good advice there indeed. There's quite a few questions about people wondering, what happens if we get stuck with understanding? Are we trained to deal with that? What happens if we make a mistake? How do we deal with that? So I can see there's quite a lot of sort of fascination among the audience of, how we sort of cope, because it's true that sometimes, well, just like this question, sometimes speakers are going really fast, sometimes they have accents, sometimes they're hard to understand. And yes, it happens. Sometimes we make mistakes because we are human. And has anybody ever had anything like that happen to them? Or how do you deal with mistakes that might creep in? It doesn't happen very often, I can assure you, but has anybody had that ever happen to them? Beth, go ahead.
I can safely say that I have definitely made mistakes whilst interpreting. Sometimes if you're working in simultaneous, you have just about enough time to retract, say, a number, and very, very quickly say, sorry, million, not thousands, if you realize in time. Sometimes you might be very lucky, and if you haven't noticed that you've made a mistake, a colleague might be able to tell you, either by sticking a piece of paper under your nose or by kind of miming at you. We all get better and better at mime every day, I think, especially nowadays when we find ourselves in adjacent booths rather than in the same space. And yes, sometimes you're lucky and you have enough time to fix it, and sometimes you do just have to let it go. That's part of the job. And it, like I said, I'm still waiting for the day when I do a perfect job, but I accept that it's not always easy to achieve perfection. It hasn't happened yet, and whenever I know that I've made a mistake or there was something that I could have done better, I just try to take what's useful from that experience and hope that I'll be able to apply it next time when I turn on the mic. And that's part of the job. That's part of the lifelong learning aspect. None of us are perfect, but one thing I have learned a lot from is from being able to listen to more experienced colleagues who I think some of the people we work with really are fantastic, and they're as close to perfect as we can ever hope to get. And that's something that really helps, and it gives you inspiration, something to work towards.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Beth. And I remember somebody as well saying to me at the beginning, you have to be like a magpie, anything that glitters, pick it up. And I, at the beginning, for the first at least 5 years, I had like a little book that I would write down things in that people said, colleagues, because you learn a huge amount from working with other people, whether they're more experienced or have the same experience of you. Everybody has different strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes they're just a turn of phrase or an expression that they will use. I used to write those down and try and kind of work them in then to my interpretation on another day. And it's that sort of constant curiosity and constant listening, actually. I mean, it sounds obvious as well, a bit like breathing, but we're always listening, even when we're not actually working. We're absolutely listening to our colleagues and how what they're doing, the expressions that they use. And as well, because it's teamwork, sometimes you need to help people. I mean, we've talked about when you get stuck or there's a mistake, sometimes if people have not quite got the right document, or we do help each other out in the booth as well, more actively, not just by being brilliant and having people write things down that we say, but also actively we help each other, and that's part of the joy as well. So we learn from one another, and we help one another. But Lydia, you wanted to add something?
Yes, if you don't mind, sorry to barge in, but I did want to latch on to something that Beth said. Well, and you said now about teamwork, and that one of the pleasures of the job and something that we learn to do on the job is to work as a team, and how best we can help colleagues. Some colleagues prefer to be helped less than others, and to pick up on that and to get used to working with somebody else in that way is also very important. Another thing that occurred to me is that we're talking about learning here, and learning from one's mistakes is one of the best ways of learning. I know that if there's a crucial word that I don't have at the right time, and somebody passes it to me or mouths it to me, or I will not forget that word again, that is for sure. So the silver lining is that we can learn a lot from the mistakes we make. And the final remark I wanted to make concerns perfectionism. I have to say that I think if you're too much of a perfectionist, maybe steer clear of interpreting, because you'll be constantly frustrated. We all do our very best, but there are so many variables and so many imponderables that we have to cope with, that doing an absolutely perfect job, I would say, is well nigh impossible, much as we strive after it.
Yes, absolutely. And on that note, and whilst we're talking about lifelong learning, and this is of course the subject of the panel, I'd like to launch a last poll, and this is indeed about lifelong learning. Not that one, sorry, that's the wrong one. Hang on, here we go. So we'd now, having listened to us all this afternoon, finish this sentence. I think that a job that involves lifelong learning is... Oh, I love it. Everybody's looking. It's all, the answers are very positive. We've got the possible answers are: it's terrifying, it's exciting, definitely for me, and not for me. And I can see that almost 90% of people have voted. So I'm going to end the poll there on a very, very positive note. So we're very glad that we haven't put you off interpreting with all this talk of lifelong learning. But in all seriousness, if you don't want a job that involves lifelong learning, do not become an interpreter. But I'm thrilled to see that most people find it as exciting as we do, and think that it's a job like that would definitely be something for them. Now, I'm unfortunately, we haven't been able to answer all of the questions that came to us, and a lot of them were about how to get started in the profession, and or how to come back to the profession. People who maybe started a long time ago and are thinking of coming back to the profession, or people who are translators and how do they practice. And there's just, we could really be here all afternoon and all evening, and I'm sad that our time is up, but I am going to put a slide at the up in a moment. Perhaps I'll put it up now whilst I'm talking to you. And you can find out a lot more information here about exactly how to get started, how to work for the EU. There are questions as well about, you know, how many languages do you need? What if you just have 2 active languages? So there's lots and lots of questions that we weren't able to answer because we really wanted to focus on this lifelong learning aspect, although the other questions were really interesting, and I apologize if we weren't able to answer them all. But you will find a lot of information in the Interpreting for Europe website. It's great, you can just scan that QR code and it will take you straight there. And on that website, you have all sorts of information about how to get into the profession, the language profiles that we're looking for. So for each of the official languages, we have a language profile, you know, how to start as a freelance interpreter. There were lots of questions about that as well, questions about if you got paid more if you add languages. So I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer all of those questions, but you will find a lot of information on that website. I would also encourage you to look at the video that we prepared ahead of the London Language Show, which is on YouTube. I think it was publicised along with all the other information on the London Language Show, and you can find it on YouTube. If you just type in Interpreting for Europe, it's the first video that comes up there. So I would encourage you to look at that as well, because there's more stories on there. I think that's another thing. If you're an interpreter, you have to love stories, telling stories, but particularly listening to other people's stories. And so there's lots of stories on that video about how people got into interpreting, and that may also help answer some of your questions. You know, I think sometimes there's a bit of a myth surrounding interpreting, but as you can see, we're all normal human beings. Most of us, we all started here with 2 languages. We're all brought up actually monolingually, I think, at least the 4 of us are here, and that happens much more than you would think. People tend to think you have to be, you know, brought up bilingually or as diplomat's son or daughter, and that's absolutely not the case. We're just normal people. Most of us have done language degrees like you're doing now, and then went on to do interpreting degrees. But as I said, you'll find a lot more information there. And if you can also just Google Interpreting for Europe and it will take you to that website. But just before we close, we're a few minutes over time, but I think I would just like to ask each of the panelists as they say goodbye to you, and it's really been such a pleasure to share this afternoon with you. I'm sad that we're not in London live. We've all been there live before, and it's obviously much lovely if you can have face-to-face conversations with people. We're sorry that we can't see all the attendees. But thank you for answering the polls, for chatting to us, for answering the questions. It's been very enriching for us as well. But just as we leave, I would like you to say, as you say goodbye, one thing, what you love most about your job, just to really send our audience on their way with great enthusiasm and excitement for this wonderful profession of ours. Beth.
Thank you, everyone. Say goodbye. And yeah, I would say that what I love about interpreting is that every day is a school day.
Thank you, Lorraine.
From my side too, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us this evening and for all your questions. I was thinking about this, and I think what I like most about interpreting is that it pushes me completely out of my comfort zone. And I think that's a good thing.
Indeed. Lydia?
Yes, thank you all for coming and for taking such an interest and putting such interesting things in the chat and the questions and everything. It's been great. What I have always loved about interpreting is the variety, the fact that as a language lover, I can help other people communicate in different languages. That's it, I think. So thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Iceland, Rio, Czech Republic, Belgium. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and do check out our website, and you'll hopefully find more answers there. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody.